Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Please welcome your hosts, Hodinkee Editor-at-Large Jason Heaton and Senior Writer James Stacey, and your guests, Collector Reza Ali Rashidian and Oris co-CEO Rolf Studer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out to the Dive Watch panel. I'm absolutely thrilled to be even just a part of this. We have an absolutely killer panel here for you. We're going to dig in on new and old dive watches, and there'll be a chance for questions in just a few minutes, so if something comes up that you're interested in, we'll get you a mic towards the end of the chat. All right, fellas, I think we're going to keep it pretty simple to start. Start with Jason. Why dive watches?
I think, you know, for a couple of reasons, for me, the great history of the diving watches going back to the middle 50s coincides with just an incredible era of exploration of the world. And I think the watches, these dive watches have been present at so many incredible historical events. And that juxtaposition of sort of precision engineering and durability, I think is very appealing to me. Personally, as a diver, even though arguably dive computers have taken over from dive watches in regular use, that ability to take something that is a keepsake, a memento, something of precision engineering, and take it to extreme places and do incredible things with it, and then Monday morning be able to look down on your wrist and see it and have this tangible memento. You can't take your, I mean, you could, but your dive mask and your tank to work. I mean, you're not going to do that, but you can always look down on your wrist and say, the last time I was wearing this, I was diving a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean or something like that. I think those kind of two elements are what stand out for me.
Fantastic. And Rolf, why dive watches?
Well, they are beautiful. They are beautiful timepieces. They are casual in these down-dressed times. Often fits with your outfit. They're versatile. You can wear with a suit, you can wear with your jeans. They're very useful. If you fall in the pool, your cell phone won't work anymore. Your dive watch still will. And they have high emotional value. It makes you think of doing something else than going to the office, being at the beach, being, you know, just doing boys stuff instead of being in front of your laptop or computer. I think that's it.
What do you think? Why dive watches? Because you're obviously very, very into dive watches in a very special way. Certainly old watches. What's the appeal?
Well, I think there's an umbilical link between the specification of the dive watch and the birth of wristwatches. Wristwatches were born as a result of a need for not just a timepiece that told time, but an accurate timepiece and a rugged timepiece during a time of war, namely the First World War. And that's the watch that they would have wanted. And I think that the specification of a dive watch was how that wristwatch became popular and wearable and approachable, because people wanted something that they could wear and never take off.
Right. And as we have transitioned out of a time, like Jason mentioned, where you even need a dive watch, or even in some ways we've blurred the lines between what is a dive watch and isn't. Is it the bezel? Obviously there's a specification to a strict dive watch, but it's not just water resistance, it's not just a certain functionality. What do you think it is about, looking back at the past of those sorts of adventurous spirits that have led to kind of an enduring product category that it doesn't necessarily need to exist?
I mean, I think, as I said earlier, that link with, when you put on a dive watch, whether it's a Rolex, an Oris, an Omega, it ties you with this, you immediately are tied to this lineage of incredible exploits, and certainly that requires that you have a built-in sort of interest in that sort of thing, and some people don't, and that's fine, but for somebody like me and for a lot of people, clearly, because of how popular dive watches are, it's just this tangible link. You put it on, and there's this connection with Jacques Cousteau and James Bond and just countless adventurers, both fictional and real, who have done incredible things with dive watches on. And if you can sort of channel even a little bit of that by wearing one, it can sort of bolster your confidence. For instance, sitting in front of a group of people talking publicly might not be the most comfortable thing in the world for an introverted writer. But wearing a dive watch that has been on adventures with me, it's almost a talisman or a good luck charm. And I can look down and say, I've been through far scarier situations than pretty much anything I'm going to encounter wearing this watch. So yeah. I think it's part of that for me.
And Rolf, from like more of a product perspective, how do you find a way to connect the legacy of dive watches with something that's sold today and has to be marketed to today's tastes? And obviously we've seen a growing and maybe in some ways even fading trend towards new vintage, where you have brand new watches that look like old watches. Where do you think the sweet spot is as far as connecting with people at a product level?
Yeah, I think it's really like you just said, it creates an emotional value. And the question, do you need a dive watch? Of course you need a dive watch, because it makes you happy, right? That's the reason, basically, for any watch to wear, that it gives you pleasure. Mm-hmm. And with a dive watch, there's so many emotions coming with it, so many thoughts during your day. You look at your watch a number of times, and hopefully each of these times it makes you happy. A more technical dive watch for other reasons than a retro dive watch. Retro dive watches create these emotions of a Dr. No or a Goldfinger or I don't know what. Contemporary dive watches, more of actual diving. But up to everybody's liking, I think it's a source of emotion and a source of a 5 seconds break that you can have during your day as often as you want.
For sure. No, I would agree that it's definitely, it's something that you buy, definitely not only because it makes you feel good, but it connects with these sorts of endeavors that maybe you're not always a part of or even a part of at all. Like a lot of people have dive watches and don't dive. And it speaks at a certain level to their collectability, which is, I think, what I would pass to you, Reza. Like, where do you find the collectability in dive watches? You're a preeminent collector of Rolex dive watches, and I know that you're interested in other watches as well. How do you define the collectability of a dive watch today?
Well, the thing is, there's a sort of macro picture and a micro picture. The macro picture being the importance of the dive watch to the human condition, that sense of adventure that human beings like, the search for resources, just the search for over-engineering. You want to have something that can do much more than you'll ever do, so you know that it's going to be reliable. And that's why I was making references to the First World War and later on in conflicts that this watch it's got to be over-engineered so that it's reliable. Then there's the micro picture, which is it's just the sheer variety that you get especially in Rolexes, on the dials. Mm-hmm. So much so that it's kind of almost a game of spot the difference, because the design is classic. It's the oyster case, and if you have OCD, it's a fantastic thing to get involved in. And if you don't have OCD, you will get OCD by the time you've started collecting.
So there's a certain amount of nuance within something that, you know, if you put them all on a table, someone, not us in this room, someone in a different room might just say they're all the same watch.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a recurring nightmare on that I show my collection to someone and I say, you know, can you see the difference? And they say no. And I say, well, here's a loop, you know, have a look. Can't you see the serif, the font's different, the crown's different, all of this kind of stuff? And they say, well, I still don't see it. And then I take the loop and look, and they're all the same in my nightmare.
That's
you know.
Oh yeah.
The differences are minute in some instances.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously there's where you go into the hyper collectible range is where they have a very specific story.
Very specific.
And could you speak to a couple maybe highlights in your collection? Because there's some here, the stories are incredible.
In terms of the differences in the dials, or
or even just the model itself, you know, that has a great backstory.
The great backstory. I mean, the greatest watch I have, I think, in my collection must be the Deep Sea Special, #1.
Right.
Which was the watch that, you know, when Blancpain brought out their 50 fathoms in 1953, and they were claiming 100 meters or 97 meters. And Rolex themselves in 54 in Basel brought out the 6204, their first dive watch. Rolex already had a watch in 1953 that could go down thousands of meters. And in and by itself, that was a slam dunk for Rolex. I mean, they had already taken over the domain of the dive watch by having that watch and then embarking on the deep sea dive with the Trieste in 1960, where they went down, best part of 11 kilometers. So that is a watch that kind of has its own weather system. And it's a real dive watch, because if you actually wear it, it's so chunky that even if you go swimming, you'll go diving whether you want it or not. It'll take you down. So that I think is a highlight of any dive watch collection.
For sure. And when it comes to collecting, Jason, what's kind of your, as more of a, we'll call it a journeyman diver, watch collector, where's your perspective on collecting?
I have a few vintage dive watches, and I think I was going to follow up on Reza's comments, because I think what's interesting about collecting vintage dive watches, or even those from just a decade or so ago, is that you don't, especially with really old ones. There was a gentleman we just talked to 5 minutes before coming on stage who has an old 50 fathoms that he said belonged to a French fisherman for 30 years. Or was worn by a French fisherman for 30 years. Reza has an incredibly rare military Submariner on his wrist. This gentleman in the front row has a Doxa that he bought recently from a diver, and he wears it surfing. These are collectible vintage pieces that when you hold them in your hand, they have to contain stories. I'm not saying this to diminish people who collect dress watches or complicated Pateks or something, but a dive watch is something that the stories are almost embedded in every scratch, every bit of patina, and it's almost a miracle that so many of them have survived to this day. Speaking as someone who isn't really a true collector, it is what's appealing about the old ones, and I think to have one or two really special vintage pieces, it just carries that appeal. Then when you leap forward and you look at how popular dive watches remain and what you can do with the new ones. And I think people are so careful with vintage watches and are so concerned about babying them or not washing their hands with them and things. And I think that watch that Reza's wearing has been through far worse things than we will ever be able to do ourselves here. From washing your hands to jogging on the street to sailing a boat or whatever you're going to do with it. So I'm all for, caring for them, but also wearing them.
Absolutely, and I mean, there's also a case to be made that in some scenario you create something that's collectible at a personal level by using it and wearing it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think you start to see some of the collectability that people, kind of an interesting concept where you make that dive watch your own, and this goes with a lot of sport watches. Really, you might wear it through, run a marathon or run a Tough Mudder or something like that, and you have it on your wrist, or when you get certified for diving, and it's interesting to kind of add those experiences to something that you bought, new from a store that you started at Stories. And Rolf, with you look at the success that Oris has had in producing like a considerable range of dive watch, like a wide style and a wide effect, and I've dove with several of them, lucky to dive with several of them, and Where do you see the kind of the fascination for dive watches reflected in the product?
Yeah, what we just discussed, this emotional side, this adventure that's built into every dive watch. I think the success of bronze as a material for contemporary dive watches shows that very well, right? I wear my Colbert for 3 years, and I just wear it in the ocean, and whenever I look at it, I think how I play with my kids at the beach, and it's my story built into this watch. And I think that's what people are looking for these days. A watch, it's disconnected from just showing the time. It's great that they show the time, but they are a source of emotion, a source of inspiration, and bronze, I think, is a material that shows that very well. And if you think back 20, 25 years ago, if you would have made a bronze watch, it would have found maybe a few enthusiasts, but it would never have been successful on a broad level, because something that changes its appearance can't be a proper mechanical Swiss watch. And I think that example shows very well how the approach of consumer watches has changed over the last few years.
I think it's interesting, and everybody here should check out that watch in person, because the patina's wild. It's really cool. And but I do think it's interesting to contrast where maybe the initial fascination with dive watches was in the diving part of it, and I think now it's in the watch part of it. So it's an enthusiast-driven kind of sphere, and I think that exists at both the vintage level and obviously at the new product level. There's success on both sides. And Reza, where do you see new watches? Where do you see the transition point between new and collectible?
Well, I think there's been quite a few years now, quite a few decades, that the dive watch has the specs on it have become so high that no human being can actually use it for diving. I mean, you can't go that deep. If it goes more than 700 meters, we don't have any evidence that a human being can survive it. So people buy these things as an exercise in over-engineering again. And it's like owning a car that does 220 miles an hour. You don't need to do it, but it's nice to know it can do 220.
You could go.
You could go, except that you cannot go physically, literally. I mean, you take the new Rolex Deep Sea, and you cannot go 3,000 whatever meters. So people buy it for the style and for the history. I think that you're buying a piece of history. There's a lot of lineage. There's a lot of stories behind that watch.
And by having that watch, you
can participate in that in that story.
For sure. And when you consider kind of dive watches not only like as a category, but as in watch design for the past several decades and beyond, and it's interesting to think of them kind of beyond their emotional ability or anything, and more just as like now an element of style. And I don't know where that lands with any of you. Obviously, you've got so there is a certain lasting element of a Submariner as an item of style. Steve McQueen and all of these kind of icons wore them. And how do you think that speaks necessarily to just the presence of it even outside of diving?
Well, I think again, it's a watch you can put on and never take off. You can go to the beach. You can wear a black tie. You can wear your tux. It's so flexible, a dive watch, and I think it has a certain kind of, when you wear a complicated, say, Patek Philippe, it wears you, and when you wear a dive watch, it's almost your companion. That's the difference, I think. And if you with it, and if you wear a modern one, you still have all the history that goes with it.
Yeah, with it.
You have one of the
concept.
classics.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think dive watches have become the form of the dive watch has become as part of our culture and sort of cultural heritage as a peacoat or a tuxedo or a pair of work boots or something. You see it; it's instantly recognizable from the strangest ones that came along in the 70s to a Submariner to a Doxa, whatever. They have this very recognizable presence about them that when you see someone wearing them, and maybe it's my own romanticism, but it sort of, it imbues that, the wearer with a certain, it makes them that much more interesting. You know, you almost think to tell, you know.
For sure.
And just that, the very legible dial, the rotating bezel, usually kind of a burly strap or bracelet, it's just so iconic now that it's become like a wardrobe staple, or even beyond a wardrobe staple. So.
Yeah, for me it's similar as with the SUVs. Nobody or very little people really use their SUVs to what they are built for. It has become somewhat a lifestyle. Yeah. And the dive watches do exactly that same thing, right? They could do things that you would never do, but as men, we just like to have things that would be able to do things that you never do. Yeah. And fits in that same category.
Yeah, I agree.
And Rolf, it'd be interesting to consider, like, when you, obviously we spoke a bit about kind of the new vintage trend, and we see that in the Diver 65, but when Oris sets out, you know, to design, say, a new watch, a watch that will be like distinctly new, like something like a Der Meistertacher, you know, a modern sort of dive watch, how do you approach that to try and respect everything behind it, but without doing everything that's behind it necessarily?
Yeah, you can approach that from two sides. You can say, okay, these old pieces, they were nice, let it be now, that was the past, let's focus on the future. But also, as a brand, you're proud on your history. And I had this discussion at some point with somebody in Japan, and this person said, look, only brand with a history can do historical pieces. And that's very true. So you look at your history and you try to match it with today's possibilities. And often you get a product that is much more emotional than your standard product, because all these values, all these assets of your brand are in this watch. That's true with the Oris, that's true with the Diver 65, and it's a very nice way to showcase what you actually stand for, which includes also respecting your past.
Yeah, and it still can be reflected in a thoroughly modern product at some level, as long as the design is true to that history.
Yes, that's another interesting question. How do you do it when you do a vintage watch, right? Do you do it the same way as the watches were in these times? Do you use a plexi crystal, or do you use a sapphire? Do you use brass as a case material? Do you use stainless steel? We decided to use modern technology, but trying to keep the emotion. It's more about the emotion than about the object. As with many things, if you are able to bring that emotion across, people will understand what you wanted. And that's the case when we approach dive watches. With the Diver 65, for example, it doesn't have a ceramic bezel. Even this would be better than the aluminum bezel, but it would kill the watch. It has a sapphire crystal, but the sapphire crystal is nicely domed like the old plexiglasses. So then you try with all these elements, and you have lots of samples, and you just try to get to the point that you think the emotion is right, and then you know your product is right.
I think we've seen little murmurs of backlash against kind of the new vintage style watches. Some people are saying, oh, you know, stop regurgitating. But I would argue that pretty much any dive watch creation these days is an homage to something old. They're all, I mean, dive watches are, there's a limited sort of palette with which you can design them and still call it a dive watch. And the fact that, you know, people really aren't using dive watches to time dives much anymore gives this freedom to be able to kind of just sort of honor that sort of, or take a retrospective look, and it's kind of your, mechanical watches are obsolete anyway, so you might as well, every watch that we're all interested in, most of us in this room, is an homage to something old. It is a retro piece, just by its very nature, so.
Right.
I'm all for it.
Yeah. And Reza, where does that trend kind of land for you, the new vintage trend? Obviously, you love vintage watches. Do you find the fact, like, is it surprising to you that it's been this successful? It makes perfect sense because you see kind of similar aesthetics.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I think that, and it's perfectly valid for a brand who's worked so hard to create an iconic piece to milk that.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? If they can make it bigger and better and update it and still have the same style, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's actually good. It's like a 911. You know, they keep doing new iterations.
Yeah, they always
same
seem
car.
to somehow make it better. Yeah,
Make it better.
I know what you mean. And you know, circling back on kind of your skill set, which would be, you know, collecting. And how long have you been collecting for people who maybe don't know your background?
Just over 20 years.
Okay. And so if you were to make a recommendation to a young guy or gal in the audience that's setting out, maybe they have a couple of the new watches, maybe they have a couple old watches, how would you say, like, maybe not at a specific model or brand or anything, but how is it, what do you wish you had known 20 years ago that you know now?
I wish I'd much watches would cost today, so I would buy more.
Well, sure.
I'd just hoover up even more stuff.
Uh-huh.
I think that, you know, you've just got to buy whatever you like and whatever interests you.
Right.
And enjoy it. And if as a part of that, that watch becomes a classic in the future, whether it's via your own experiences or via its rarity or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You've got to buy what you like. And then you're okay. You're enjoying it.
You take time, develop your taste, and just stick with things that you appreciate.
Stick with things you like yourself. That's my big, just love what you own rather than go on other people's advice and look at something and think, well, I don't really like that.
Right. But it's one that you have
Yeah,
to
what
buy
you have to
because you're
have,
in the
exactly.
mix.
I say just buy the stuff you like.
Rolf, what do you think? You've been in watches for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody wanted to kind of get into it now and skip some of the pitfalls or trying to understand, I mean, like, maybe it's easier to say, like, from your standpoint, surprise that people might.
Let me answer the first question first. I think it's really that. With whatever you collect, you got to start with what you like. And when you start with these things, you start to develop a taste, and then that will lead you somewhere. And that will lead you maybe to new watches, maybe to more old watches. I think, yeah, you should just go for what you like. You should not be blinded by brand names. You should really go for the product. You should understand what things are about, and then there's nothing you can do wrong. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to buying new watches, I think it's the same thing. Well, it's a free world. Buy what you like, right? And go for a product that makes you smile and that makes you happy. Don't go for the product that makes other people happy, but go for the one that makes you happy. And you can do wrong.
Right.
I think what's really cool about dive watches and collecting dive watches is that if you look at the kind of the first generation of dive watches that came about in the 50s when diving was just becoming a sport of its own, you had these iconic, very few brands that were releasing them at that time. And then as that second generation came along from the mid-60s on, you started to see this explosion of creativity with every brand wanting a dive watch in its collection, because even in the 60s it would have represented some of the same things we're talking about today, that adventurous sort of ambiance that it has, its ability to go places that nobody else could. So every brand was creating these, and you have these brands that are long since defunct that no one's heard of. You have that old Silvana,
yeah, for sure,
from the 60s, and you just have all these, and they're as interesting visually, maybe not as important or collectible from a financial standpoint, but just from an interest standpoint. To find, for instance, one of the Oris dive watches from the 60s upon which the Diver 65 is based, it was one of those brands that at the time, they were, affordable and people just were going to go out and actually use it diving, as opposed to when you get into the 70s and the 80s and the dive watch was sort of drifting further from actual use into more of a luxury product. And I think, I guess if I had to encourage somebody young, I'd be like, don't get hung up on brand unless you've got some money and you're willing to kind of put in the research, but seek out those quirky little weird dive watches, all sorts of dial colors and strange bezels and straps and everything that you see pop up in the mid 60s through the 70s. those are the ones that I really like, you know.
And I know, like, Jason, you and I have talked a lot about this, and I often wonder if there's something to the fact that a lot of guys' first watches are dive watches, or a dive type, so a watch with a bezel and some water resistance and that sort of thing. And I wonder how much that speaks to just carrying on kind of a progressive lineage. I don't know, Rolf, if you guys see that, like, people buy Oris for their kids when they turn 18 or something like that, and if you see that kind of pass through generations, just the concept that, like, a good watch for a young man or woman would be a dive watch.
Yeah, as we discussed before, it's a watch that you can wear with everything. So it's certainly a good watch to start also a collection. And I think what's fascinating these days in the world of watches is what happened to it with social media. Actually, what brought us here today, right? A few years ago, there were some special interest magazines with a few 10,000 readers around the world, and now we have all these websites, we have Facebook, we have Instagram with millions of followers, of hashtags and brands, and it has become such an exciting community that the exchange with these people, at least for me, that's so enriching. It's so nice that this object watch, and especially dive watch, because they are the ones that are collected most, bring you in touch with all these people.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jason and I would say we couldn't agree more. I mean, it's largely I have a living because of this, and it's not something you would imagine necessarily. And it'd be interesting to compare that. When you first got into collecting, what was the scene like? Was there like 5 people that knew everything and they occasionally like put it on a forum, or?
No, we were 5 people who knew nothing, really, to start. Because, of course, especially with Rolex was very... And there's an event that I remember, we had a dinner and we all thought we were collectors and experts and all this. And I was wearing a military Submariner 5517 reference. And another guy was wearing a 5513, and he said, well, why is yours different? And we thought, well, what's different about it? So we looked at them, and mine had a maxi dial, but we had never seen a maxi dial until that point. So we learned at that dinner that there was a maxi dial. Now, of course, there's 4 variations, everyone knows everything. But it was a kind of a pro-am affair when we started collecting. And it was a voyage of discovery, and a lot of the work was done actually by enthusiasts in the Rolex world, because again, the information wasn't forthcoming. And it was kind of an innocent time in a way, but plenty of scope to make mistakes as well. So it's good that there's more information out there now.
You figure today is not only more, do you think it's easier to ascertain good information versus bad?
I think so. I think because there's been a lot of cross-reference of watches and cross-referencing of
more time to refine the information.
Absolutely, absolutely.
For sure. Well, you know, I think we can probably move on to questions. Are there a few questions maybe in the audience? We're going to have a couple microphones, so if you have a question, please put your hand up and we can get you a microphone.
I just have a comment about one thing I think you didn't suggest, was that dive watches are usually the most robust of whatever a manufacturer is making at the time. And they're a great, there's an advantage to wearing a watch that is so robust that you worry about what it might hit instead of the watch itself being damaged.
Sure.
And I've been collecting for 50 years, and my dive watches have almost been pretty much service-free.
Right.
Because they tend to need service much less frequently than watches that have more air exposure. And air does not penetrate dive watches, especially when the real deep ones, very easily. So they stay less polluted.
For sure.
I also bought both my boys dive watches as their first watch, because I figured, go ahead and go kill them, and we'll see how it goes from there. And they're both collectors now. Yeah,
certainly definitely one of the toughest wearing watches that you can buy today or collect at a certain level, because they were made to be indestructible. You know, as tough to kill as possible, and then they were, you know, theoretically worn by people that were also pretty tough to kill. Any other questions?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'd like to know what is your criteria of a dive watch, and why would it be better than a sports watch?
Better than a
Sports watch. I mean,
yeah.
I know what a dive watch is. I know what
Yeah.
a field watch is. I mean, a sports watch.
You know he asked what's the difference between sort of what's the difference between a sports watch and a dive watch, and I think I was thinking about this earlier and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of another genre of watch that has an ISO, an international standard set for what you can call a dive watch. I don't think there is one for. There isn't certainly one for a driver's watch or a dress watch, or maybe there is for a pilot's watch. I'm not sure. I think there might be some standards there, but a dive watch you have to follow a specific standard of legibility within 9.8 inches from your face set in total darkness, a way to track elapsed time, a minimum of 100 meters water resistance, etc. And on the other hand, I think nowadays with people using dive watches less for actual diving, the criteria has loosened a little bit, and I think I like to think of a lot of these watches as sort of general sports watches or water sports watches, where you could wear it swimming on the beach and then, or sailing or surfing or something. You strip off your wetsuit, put on your trunks and t-shirt, and you can walk straight to the bar. Mm-hmm. With the watch on your wrist and grab your beer, and somebody says, "Oh, cool watch," and hey, I was just out surfing with it. As opposed to dive computers, just don't have the same panache wearing them. They're big and ugly and digital, and you certainly wouldn't be surfing with your Speedmaster. So
maybe I can add to that from a manufacturer's point of view. As you said, there is a ESO norm, there is a DIN norm in Germany. That define what a dive watch actually has to be and has to do. And that gives you a totally different approach when you go into designing and making these watches, because you make them to these specifications. When you work on a sports watch, that's